In a town where nothing ever changed, a mystery appeared that no one could erase. Cedar Hills, Montana, population 6,800. The kind of place where neighbors waved, church bells rang every Sunday, and nobody locked their doors at night. But on November 15th, 1999, something happened inside the Holden family home at 2716 Maple Ridge Road that would leave investigators searching for answers for more than 2 decades. Mark and Patricia Holden, a respected engineer and a quiet librarian, vanished without a trace after what seemed like an ordinary family dinner. No packed bags, no car missing, no phone calls, no signs of forced entry, only a locked house and complete silence. Their 2 sons claimed they went to bed and woke up to find their parents gone. Police searched the woods, the town, and every record they could access. Nothing. Eventually, the case froze, stamped "missing, no leads," and buried deep in the county archives. But 24 years later, new technology, a new investigator, and one suspicious spot inside the Holden basement would reopen this case and rewrite everything the town thought it knew. Before we continue, what do you think happened that night? Comment your theory below. Cedar Hills, Montana was the kind of small American town where people recognized every last name on the annual school roster. With a population of around 6,800, it sat quietly between long stretches of forest and back roads that rarely saw unfamiliar traffic. Most residents worked at local businesses, the public school system, or the regional service departments. Crime existed, but it was minor and predictable, usually property disputes, shoplifting, or underage vandalism that could be resolved with a phone call to parents. For decades, Cedar Hills carried a reputation as a place where dangerous or unexplained cases simply did not happen. The Holden family lived at 2716 Maple Ridge Road, a property positioned at the edge of town where homes were spaced farther apart and porch lights served more as night markers than security measures. Their house was built in 1978, a 2-story home with a basement, a detached storage shed, and a narrow walkway that led into the woods behind the property. There were no past complaints, no police reports, and no recorded disturbances connected to their address. Anyone reviewing the town's archived paperwork would find nothing unusual about the residence for over 20 years. Mark Holden was 52 years old, employed full-time as a construction engineer at Rocky Mountain Construction Company. He worked consistent hours, clocked in daily, and rarely took personal leave except for the holiday season. His co-workers described him as serious, reliable, and reserved. No internal complaints were filed against him during his employment, and he had no legal disputes, no public arguments, and no financial conflicts involving his employer. His professional record showed a man who lived within routine and did not draw attention from others. His wife, Patricia Holden, was 47 and worked part-time at the Cedar Hills Public Library. She typically worked daytime hours and returned home before dusk, keeping a predictable weekly rhythm. Colleagues said she was polite, quiet, and committed to maintaining organization within the library's community program shelves. She occasionally assisted with children's reading events and attended small-town gatherings, though she preferred private routines over social groups. A co-worker later recalled, "Patricia was the kind of person who always finished what she started. She didn't break rules, and she didn't make excuses." Her personal records contained no involvement with alcohol misuse, drug concerns, or domestic disputes. The Holdens had 2 sons. Andrew, the older, was 23 years old and enrolled in mechanical engineering at Montana State University. He lived near campus, but frequently returned home during weekends, holidays, and occasional short academic breaks. School records listed him as academically steady, with no disciplinary infractions, no reported behavioral issues, and no history suggesting impulsive or aggressive tendencies. Although he preferred privacy and focused heavily on coursework, faculty described him as respectful and cooperative. Jacob, the younger son, was 18 years old and a senior at Cedar Hills High School. He was preparing for graduation and considering several options, including trade school, local employment, or a delayed college start. Like Andrew, he had no involvement in physical altercations, bullying, smoking violations, or juvenile records. Teachers mentioned that he kept a small friend circle and submitted assignments on time, even if he appeared somewhat introverted. His school file traced a steady academic path within behavioral red flags.
As a unit, the Holdens presented a profile of routine stability. They were not wealthy, but they were financially secure. The family maintained a traditional evening dinner schedule, observed common household routines, and did not travel frequently. They did not host late-night gatherings, did not invite unfamiliar guests, and rarely left town without notifying at least one neighbor. People in Cedar Hills viewed them as a typical, middle-class household that had found its rhythm and stayed inside it. One neighbor later summarized, "They were normal. Nothing about them ever suggested trouble." Financial documents later reviewed by investigators showed a standard mortgage, consistent bill payments, and no delinquent accounts. Their utilities, insurance plans, and credit statements were in good standing. There was no sign of forced downsizing, debt consolidation, hidden loans, or sudden lifestyle changes. If someone examined only the numbers, the Holden family looked secure and predictable, not distressed or preparing for an abrupt relocation. However, there was one detail that stood out. On November 10, 1999, 5 days before the couple disappeared, Mark made a significant cash withdrawal. The withdrawal did not match his usual spending pattern. He did not report using it for repairs, education, medical costs, travel reservations, or large household purchases. No immediate receipts, contractor appointments, or recorded transactions connected to that withdrawal ever surfaced. The absence of an explanation left a question that would eventually gain importance. Was it a coincidence, or did it mark the start of something he never disclosed? Medical and social service records offered no early warning indicators. None of the family members had documented mental health diagnoses that required long-term treatment or supervision. They had no history involving county social workers, counseling referrals, community intervention teams, or reports from mandatory reporters. The Holden address did not appear in any welfare check database, and the family was not considered at risk by any state or federal metric at that time. On paper, they were categorized as low concern. The family home itself would later become the central point of inquiry. But even before the investigation began, the property raised logistical considerations. The house included a full basement, a separate storage shed, and direct access to a wooded area behind the property. The location offered privacy, concealed angles, and limited visibility from neighbors, particularly at night. While the property was not isolated, it was positioned far enough from the main residential clusters that nighttime activity could go unnoticed. Neighbors could see the front exterior from the road, but the rear section was largely blocked by trees. Weather conditions near mid-November further complicated future assumptions. Late fall of 1999 brought early season cold, light snow, and low night temperatures. Travel after dark became less common, and many residents stayed home earlier than in warmer months. Despite the seasonal change, nothing in early November suggested that the Holden family intended to alter their routine. Work schedules, class attendance, and library shifts continued regularly. No one in the family submitted time-off requests, filed leave forms, or arranged long-term plans that required stepping away from daily responsibilities. From an outside perspective, everything in the Holden household appeared functional, consistent, and unthreatening. There were no public arguments, visible conflicts, or emergency calls that might have hinted at instability or upcoming crisis. No relatives, co-workers, or neighbors sensed that anything unusual was about to unfold. Yet all of that would soon be challenged. Within days, the Holden family's routine would be abruptly interrupted, and two members of the household would disappear, leaving behind a locked home, unanswered questions, and a timeline that would remain in dispute for the next 25 years. Nothing in Part 1 explains what truly happened. It only frames the final moment before everything changed. The last confirmed sighting of Mark and Patricia would soon become the first unexplained silence in Cedar Hills's most enduring case. Monday night, November 15th, 1999, was the last time anyone could say for sure that Mark and Patricia Holden were alive. It was cold in Cedar Hills. Light snow had fallen on and off during the day, and the temperature had dropped quickly after sunset. By early evening, most houses along Maple Ridge Road were already lit from the inside. At 2716 Maple Ridge Road, the Holden house followed its usual routine. Sometime between 6:30 and 7:15 p.m., the family sat down to dinner. All four were home, Mark and Patricia at the table, with Andrew back from university for a long weekend, and Jacob in his usual seat. Nothing about that meal has ever been described as unusual. In later statements, both brothers agreed that there was no major argument during dinner. No shouting, no threats, no slammed doors. They talked about school, work, and ordinary things. One neighbor would recall years later, "I could see the dining room light through the trees. It just looked like any other Monday night." After the meal, the evening began to break apart into its usual pieces. Around 7:30 p.m., Mark was believed to be in the living room, either reading or watching the news. That matched how his evenings normally went at the start of the work week. Patricia was likely in the kitchen, clearing plates, rinsing dishes, loading the dishwasher, and, according to what her co-workers knew about her habits, probably setting aside food for the next day's lunch. Patricia was known as someone who planned ahead. A colleague from the library would later say, "She always had her next day mapped out. She wasn't the kind of person who just walked away from commitments." Andrew stated that he went upstairs after dinner, into his room, to check his emails and go over some course material from Montana State. Jacob said he stayed in his own room, also upstairs, listening to music and working on homework for Cedar Hills High. Neither brother mentioned anyone visiting the home that evening. In their accounts, there were no friends dropping by, no extended family stopping in, and no unexpected knocks on the door between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. The first crack in the quiet evening came from outside the house, not inside. At around 9 p.m., a nearby neighbor later told investigators they heard raised voices coming from the direction of the Holden property. The sound lasted less than 10 minutes. The neighbor remembered a man's voice being louder than the others, dominating the exchange, and then everything fading back to silence. They could not make out words or identify exactly who was speaking. They didn't hear furniture move, glass break, or anything that sounded like a physical fight. To them, it sounded like a brief family argument. "If you live long enough in one neighborhood," the neighbor said later, "you get used to hearing people disagree once in a while. It didn't sound like an emergency." Because of that, nobody picked up the phone to call the police. Inside the house, both Andrew and Jacob would later deny remembering a clear argument at that specific time. Andrew did not describe a confrontation at 9 p.m. Jacob acknowledged that his parents sometimes disagreed, but he did not point to a specific loud incident that night. This gap between what someone outside the home heard and what the people inside remembered or were willing to say would become one of the first small inconsistencies in the timeline. As the evening moved toward late night, another detail from outside the family became important. A second neighbor, whose property backed up closer to the Holden lot and had a partial view of the basement window, recalled that the basement light was still on well after 10 p.m. They did not see anyone enter or leave through the rear of the property. They only noticed a rectangle of light from a small basement window near ground level. This neighbor said they rarely saw the Holden basement light burning that late, especially on a Monday. Still, at the time, it was only a passing observation, not something they thought to report. Inside the house, according to his later statement, Andrew went upstairs for the night around 9:30 p.m. He said he closed his bedroom door, spent some time with schoolwork or reading, and then went to sleep around 10:30 p.m. He insisted he did not hear anything unusual after that. No loud arguing, no heavy movements, no doors slamming, no car engine starting outside. He said he did not see his parents leave the house and had no direct memory of them going to bed or going out. This placed Andrew, by his own account, in a position where he could not confirm anything that might have happened in the home after 10:30 p.m. His version of that period is essentially silence. Jacob's description of the same time frame has more sound but no clear picture. He stated that between about 10 p.m. and close to 11 p.m. while in his room, he heard what he believed was a door opening and closing quietly. He could not say whether it was the front door or the back door. He did not hear distinct voices with it. He did not look down the staircase or out of his window to see who might be leaving. In his mind, his parents stepping out late or moving around the house did not automatically signal danger. He later said he assumed they were either going outside briefly or turning in for the night. He would eventually explain, "I heard a door, but I didn't think it mattered." While all of this was unfolding, or not unfolding, the house phone remained completely inactive. Landline records later confirmed that from 8 p.m. to midnight, there were no incoming or outgoing calls. There were no emergency calls, no long-distance calls, no quick calls to neighbors, co-workers, or relatives. At that time, in 1999, cell phones were not yet widely used in small towns like Cedar Hills, and the landline was still the primary way to contact people at night. The absence of any phone activity supports one key point. If the Holdens left the property, they did not use the home phone to arrange a ride, to warn anyone, or to ask for help. Meanwhile, the physical evidence of that night would later show a house that did not look like it belonged to a couple planning to leave. Sometime after everyone says they went to their rooms, both family cars remained parked in the garage. No one on the street reported hearing engines start
or seeing headlights come down the driveway. The dining table still had food and dishes out, as if the end of the meal had been interrupted or delayed. Wallets, identification, and personal papers belonging to Mark and Patricia stayed inside the home. They did not pack bags. No suitcases were missing. Clothing remained in the closets, coats on hooks, shoes in their usual places. Aside from the unexplained cash withdrawal Mark had made 5 days earlier, there was no sign that the couple had tried to pull resources together for a sudden departure. From the outside, the house looked intact. There were no broken windows, no pried open doors, and no damaged locks. The back door was later found locked with the interior bolt engaged, something that would normally require someone inside the home to set it. The front door lock showed no tool marks or scratches that might indicate forced entry. Every accessible point at ground level appeared undisturbed. If someone had come in through a door or window, they either left no trace or used a method that did not damage anything visible. This led to a difficult question that would haunt the case. If Mark and Patricia left the house, how did they do it without taking their car, their identification, or any bags? And how did the house end up secured from the inside? One more detail hangs over that night: the decision not to call anyone. Either Andrew nor Jacob contacted the police, relatives, or neighbors during the night of November 15th. They did not report hearing something that made them fear for their parents' safety. They did not knock on a neighbor's door to ask if anyone had seen their car leave. Both sons would later explain that they believed their parents were either out briefly or asleep, and that there was no reason to panic. That choice created a window of time between around 11 p.m. and roughly 7 a.m. the next morning, where no one outside the Holden home had any confirmed knowledge of what was happening inside. That 8-hour stretch would become a complete blind spot in the timeline. No witnesses, no phone records, no documented movement, and no immediate questions asked. By the time the town started its next day, everything that mattered in the Holden case had already happened. The last normal family dinner was over. The last voices neighbors heard had gone quiet. The basement light, seen from outside, would eventually turn off. And inside the house at 2716 Maple Ridge Road, something had changed that no one recognized until it was far too late. The next morning, workplaces would notice 2 empty chairs, and the quiet house at the edge of town would no longer look like just another home in Cedar Hills. But that belongs to the next part of the story. Here, in part 2, the night simply ends with a locked house, 2 sons upstairs, and a missing piece of time that no one has ever been able to fully fill in. The next day started like any other workday in Cedar Hills, until people realized 2 familiar faces were missing. At Rocky Mountain Construction, Mark Holden's co-workers noticed his empty chair first. He was not the kind of man who drifted in late without a word. If he was sick, he called. If weather was bad, he called. That morning, there was nothing. No phone call, no email, no message passed through the front desk. At first, they assumed traffic or a small delay. But as the morning moved on, and his usual arrival time came and went, concern began to grow. Across town, at the Cedar Hills Public Library, staff were also waiting. Patricia's shift was on the schedule. Her name was on the rota. Her cart of books had been left half-finished the previous day, ready for her to pick up again. She didn't walk in when the doors opened. She didn't call to explain. A co-worker later said, if Patricia was going to be even 10 minutes late, she'd let someone know. That's just who she was. That morning, she didn't let anyone know anything.
Both workplaces tried to reach the Holden home. Phone calls rang out with no answer. No one picked up to say Mark was ill, or Patricia was handling an emergency, or they'd be in later. It was as if the house on Maple Ridge Road had gone quiet overnight. At home, Jacob Holden woke up expecting to see signs of his parents' usual routine. On a normal morning, there might be the smell of coffee, the sound of cabinets closing in the kitchen, the murmur of a radio or TV in the background. That morning, the house felt still. The kitchen was empty. The coffee pot was unused. There was no one moving around downstairs. When he checked the garage, both of his parents' cars were still parked in their usual spots. The concrete floor was clean and dry. There were no fresh tire tracks, no damp patches from a vehicle brought in recently from the snow. To Jacob, that meant one thing. If his parents had gone somewhere, they had not used their cars to get there. He walked through that house. He walked through the house, room by room. The living room looked the same as the night before. The dining table still held the remains of last night's dinner. Plates and glasses left out. Chairs not pushed all the way in. A scene that felt frozen rather than cleaned up. Their bedroom offered another surprise. The bed looked as if it had never been slept in. The blankets were smooth, the pillows undisturbed. No impression of bodies lying there during the night. There was no note on the nightstand, no message on the fridge, no scrap of paper taped to a door. No indication that Mark and Patricia had planned to leave early, or that they had been called away in the middle of the night. With each empty room, Jacob's unease deepened. This was not how his parents operated. They did not leave without telling someone where they were going. He called his older brother, Andrew, to ask if their parents had mentioned any late-night plans or early appointments. Andrew had heard nothing. He confirmed that the night before, he had not heard them drive away, and had not been told they were going anywhere in particular. Andrew told Jacob to check again. Look for a note, a missing bag, anything that could explain the situation. Jacob checked, and still found nothing. At that point, both brothers agreed that something was wrong. Their parents were creatures of habit. They did not simply vanish. A little later that morning, Jacob picked up the phone and contacted the Cedar Hills Police Department to report that his mother and father were missing. He told them he didn't know when they had left the house. He said their cars were still there. They weren't answering calls, and they had not shown up at work. It wasn't framed as a dramatic plea. It was a simple report. 2 adults were gone, and there was no obvious reason why. For a small-town department, this kind of call triggered concern. There were no immediate indicators of a violent incident. No mention of screams, forced entry, or blood. But 2 adults disappearing at the same time, leaving behind vehicles and personal belongings, was serious enough that officers were dispatched to check the home in person. When Sheriff Ronald Baker and 2 officers arrived at the Holden residence, the first thing they noticed was how ordinary the house looked from the outside. The front door was closed. The yard was undisturbed. There were no broken windows, no signs of a struggle on the porch, no frantic scrawls or overturned furniture visible through the glass. The front door was locked, but the key lay on a small table just inside, within reach once they gained entry. There was no damage around the lock, no splintered frame. In the garage, Both vehicles could be seen through the small windows in the overhead door, parked neatly side by side. Inside, the initial sweep of the house raised more questions than answers. The dining table still carried the evidence of the previous night's meal. Plates, utensils, and glasses sat where they had been left. It looked like the end of a dinner that hadn't yet been cleaned up, not the careful shutdown of a house before a trip. The living room was tidy. No lamps knocked over, no cushions disturbed, no drawers pulled out and rifled through. There were no signs of ransacking. In one place after another, officers found the things you would expect adults to take with them if they were leaving voluntarily. Wallets with identification cards and cash, car keys, watches. Everyday items that people habitually grab without thinking twice. They were all there. Coats and shoes were still in place. Closets did not appear emptier than usual. The surface of the home suggested its occupants had stepped away for a moment, rather than for good.
In the basement, another detail stood out. As officers walked down the stairs, they noticed a faint scent, something like fresh paint or a newly applied coating on a wall or floor. Some sections of the basement surfaces looked slightly newer than others, as if work had been done not long before. But there were no open cans of paint, no brushes, no rollers, no receipts lying around to explain it. The observation went into the notes, but in that first pass it was just that, a detail to be recorded and revisited later. The garage inspection added to the mystery. The floor was clean and dry. There were no muddy shoe prints, no dragging marks, no unfamiliar tire tracks. Both vehicles felt cold, as if they had not been used since at least the day before. Trash cans outside the house held nothing unusual. No burned material, no suspicious packaging, no documents torn up and discarded in a hurry. The yard in the area behind the house showed no obvious gouges in the soil or signs of something heavy being moved. Once the property had been checked, officers began knocking on doors nearby, asking neighbors what they had noticed. Those living across the street said they had not seen any unfamiliar cars in the driveway that night. No one reported watching a vehicle pull in late or leaving at odd hours. People at the back of the property confirmed that the basement light had burned later than usual, but no one claimed to see people moving around outside near the tree line. One neighbor mentioned the short argument they had heard the previous evening, a man's voice raised for a brief period, then a return to silence. At the time, they had dismissed it as a normal family dispute. "You hear people get loud, then you hear nothing. You figure they worked it out," the neighbor later explained. None of them had seen anyone storm out onto the street or slam a car door. While officers were still gathering these fragments, another thread was checked: the Holdens' financial activity. A quick inquiry to their bank confirmed that there had been no recent withdrawals, purchases, or transfers since the cash Mark took out days earlier. There were no hotel charges, no airline bookings, no rental car agreements. No one had used their accounts to pay for a sudden emergency trip or quiet escape. Putting all of this together, the picture that formed was disturbing in a quiet, orderly way. 2 adults had disappeared from a locked house. Their vehicles, money, identification, and personal items were still there. The interior was intact. There were no broken entries, no apparent violence, and no clear sign of when they had gone out, if they had gone out at all.
Given those facts, the police department made a formal decision. This was no longer a simple welfare check or a late arrival to work. A missing persons case was officially opened under the number CH19990175, listing both Mark and Patricia Holden as missing. From that point on, every conversation, every small detail, and every inconsistency would need to be documented. The first step was to sit down with Andrew and Jacob and walk through their memories, hour by hour, as clearly as they could. How the family had eaten dinner, who had gone where afterward, what they had heard, what they had not heard, and what they might have overlooked. By the end of that day, Cedar Hills was no longer just a town with an odd absence. It was a town with an open file, 2 missing adults, a sealed house, and a case that did not fit neatly into any simple explanation. The questions that began in that living room and basement would soon push investigators to look past the surface of a normal family and dig deeper into their history, their relationships, and the secrets that might have been hiding in plain sight. The investigation moved into a new phase once officers realized that the Holden residence offered no clear explanation for why 2 adults had vanished. The initial walkthrough had ruled out obvious violence, forced entry, or spontaneous travel. So the case shifted from a basic welfare check to a suspicious disappearance requiring deeper interviews, expanded searches, and a review of every recorded detail surrounding the Holden family. The first step was to interview both sons again, this time with slower questioning and more precise requests for timelines. Every action, every sound, every movement from the night before was documented. Sheriff Ronald Baker wanted a full breakdown, including the order of events, the conversations at dinner, and whether either son heard footsteps moving inside the house after the kitchen lights turned off. Officers also began reviewing whether dynamics inside the family could hold answers, rather than assuming an outside intruder. From there, the investigation widened to people outside the home. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and regular contacts were asked about recent behavior, financial stress, marital issues, or sudden changes in routine. Interviews continued into the following days, and each of these individuals gave similar responses. The Holdens were quiet, private, polite, and predictable. No one reported hostile arguments, threats, or long-term tension. A co-worker at the town library offered one clear statement. Patricia was quiet, but she never looked like someone ready to walk away from her life. This was documented as a supporting observation for the hypothesis that the disappearance was not voluntary. Investigators then reviewed the marriage history. There were no reports of infidelity, restraining orders, counseling sessions, or legal disputes involving separation. Their bank statements showed routine household purchases, not transactions linked to secret communication, personal escape, or long-term planning. That included insurance, mortgage payments, groceries, and utilities with no irregular spikes. Nothing hinted at a pending breakup, relocation, or marital collapse. Attention then turned toward Mark's recent behavior. His co-workers confirmed that he had seemed more tired and distracted in the 2 months before his disappearance, but they did not describe erratic behavior, breakdowns, outbursts, or direct conflict with management. No one suggested that he was close to losing his job, He had not made complaints about harassment, debt, fraud, or threats. His stress was noted, but it lacked a direct motive or measurable cause. Investigators also looked at Patricia's personal goals. She had mentioned to 2 co-workers that she was considering returning to college or enrolling in an additional certification program for library sciences. This indicated forward planning, not withdrawal or resignation. However, it did raise a question. Was this a harmless aspiration, or could it have created private tension at home? The file recorded both interpretations because there was no evidence to clarify which one applied. The next focus was the testimonies from the Holden brothers. Andrew described the household as ordinary, with no major problems, and no signs that their parents were planning anything unusual. Jacob admitted that minor disagreements happened occasionally, but insisted they never escalated to violence or panic. Their statements aligned on the surface, but when investigators compared details, there were gaps, particularly about late-night movement, when lights turned off, and what sounds were heard from the lower floors. These inconsistencies were not large enough to prove deception, but they were significant enough to keep the case open. Search teams then expanded the physical investigation to additional areas around the home. The backyard shed was examined and photographed. Nothing inside indicated recent repair work, construction, or late-night activity. The ground outside the shed showed no fresh digging, no soil displacement, and no repeated foot traffic patterns. Officers walked into the wooded area behind the property using marked path routes, noting that the ground conditions made it quite easy to detect fresh movement. Yet they found nothing significant. No broken branches, no disturbed snow patches, no clothing fibers, and no drag marks. Over the following days, trained canine units were brought in to sweep the yard, driveway, back trail, and wooded area. The dogs did not find a scent trail leading away from the property, nor did they alert officers to buried items near the house perimeter. This added weight to the possibility that Mark and Patricia did not exit the home through normal outdoor pathways. Parallel to the physical search, authorities began reviewing travel and transportation records. They checked regional bus stations, state highway cameras, flight passenger lists, and hotel check-ins across Montana and neighboring states. No sightings or registrations matched Mark or Patricia after the disappearance date. They were not listed on any interstate travel logs, motel sign-in sheets, emergency hospital reports, or border crossings. In 1999, digital travel and GPS tracking were not yet widely used, but available data still suggested no movement outside the region. Local volunteer groups joined the efforts as well. For nearly 2 weeks, community members aided in mapping possible walking routes, searching creek beds, farm property lines, and abandoned structures within driving distance. Flyers were posted at grocery stores, gas stations, and community centers. However, no items belonging to the Holdens were located, and no new eyewitnesses came forward with useful information.
During this period, concerns arose about the handling of the investigation. Some residents felt that the initial response lacked urgency, especially because 2 adults were missing simultaneously. A few commented that law enforcement seemed too hesitant to label the situation as suspicious. Officers initially believed it could have been a temporary disappearance, and this early assumption may have reduced the pressure to preserve the home as a fully controlled crime scene. By the time the investigation became more serious, some potential trace evidence might already have been missed. This possibility was quietly noted inside internal reports, though no official disciplinary review was launched. As days passed, the case reached a concerning point. Despite interviews, evidence collection, search dogs, and extended canvassing, not a single physical clue existed outside the Holden property. No signs they left voluntarily. No signs someone forced them out. No financial motive, no trail, and no confirmed witness who saw them alive after that evening. Investigators reviewed the entire file again and drew the same conclusion. There was no motive to leave, no proof of an external intruder, no confirmed travel path, and no supporting physical evidence pointing to any specific theory. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Every path returned to the same house, the same night, and the same unanswered questions. With nothing left that could be pursued immediately, and no legal grounds to escalate further, the case stood still, waiting for new evidence, a confession, or an unexpected discovery. Weeks passed, and the investigation began to lose momentum. Officers continued to review the same reports, the same home walkthrough observations, and the same set of interviews without finding anything new to expand the timeline or reveal a likely direction of travel. Search teams had already swept the most obvious terrain near the Holden house, and investigators confirmed there was no sign that Mark or Patricia had used their vehicles, traveled by foot through the woods, or entered public transportation. Every lead that appeared in the early stages eventually faded. When no physical evidence turned up, the investigation slowed down, not because the case was no longer a priority, but because there was nothing left that could be acted on without speculation. The missing persons file remained open, but the level of activity decreased. Officers no longer searched daily, and search groups no longer assembled at a central point each morning. The case was still under official supervision, but it shifted from urgent search procedures to a watch-and-wait approach while authorities hoped for new information. The sheriff's office continued checking call logs, incoming reports, and tip line messages, but none of the updates were strong enough to justify a new stage of fieldwork. Because the disappearance involved two adults, state law required temporary legal management of their assets. Their property, accounts, and documents were placed under administrative control to avoid fraud, unauthorized access, or financial disputes. Their mortgage was placed on payment review, insurance policies were flagged for special handling, and recurring bills were monitored to prevent penalties. The purpose was not to seize their belongings, but to protect them until legal status could be clarified. These procedures are common in long-term missing person cases where no confirmed death certificate exists. During this period, the Holden brothers had to reorganize their lives. Andrew moved to Bozeman, Montana, where he could continue college while working part-time to support himself. The move was recorded as necessary for academic stability, not as an attempt to distance himself from the case. Jacob relocated to Idaho Falls to live with relatives, giving him a more structured environment, supervision, and distance from the house that had turned into a legal site rather than a home. Both boys remained available for questioning, but were no longer living inside the property where the investigation originated. The Holden residence at 2716 Maple Ridge Road was then partially sealed. The basement and outdoor shed were marked as restricted zones, while other areas remained accessible only under official escort. Anyone entering the home required documented authorization. The goal was to prevent accidental contamination of potential evidence, even though none had been confirmed. The house gradually transformed from a family home into a silent structure holding unanswered questions, and keys were no longer kept by family members.
Meanwhile, volunteer search teams tried to provide new direction where law enforcement no longer could. Groups of hikers, hunters, local farmers, and retired firefighters joined in. They studied maps, drove along county roads, walked through riverbanks, checked fishing access sites, visited abandoned cabins, and reviewed old campgrounds. They searched along steep terrain, under bridges, and near water access points. Some volunteers even surveyed isolated barns and disused agricultural storage facilities. Despite these efforts, nothing tied directly to the Holdens surfaced. No clothing, no personal documents, no jewelry, and no items known to belong to either spouse were found anywhere outside the home. As media attention slowed and the town tried to return to normal routine, rumors began spreading in casual conversations. Some residents speculated that the couple had staged their disappearance. Others guessed that they might have been involved in a secret conflict. A few whispered about family secrets or unpaid debts. None of these rumors were backed by evidence, and investigators refused to file unofficial theories as actionable leads. A retired library co-worker later recalled, "Everyone had a story to tell, but nobody had proof of anything." The rumors influenced public opinion, but not the case file. Authorities also reviewed anonymous submissions. Multiple reports came through voice messages, handwritten letters, and hotline calls. Most of them were vague suspicions, not factual sightings. Some callers believed they had seen people resembling the Holdens in different towns, but none of the claimed sightings could be verified. Investigators required confirmation through financial, travel, or digital records, and none matched the reported encounters. Over time, anonymous tips became more speculative and less frequent. With no real movement, the investigation shifted into administrative oversight rather than field pursuit. Officers checked the file weekly at first, then bi-weekly, then monthly. Any new potential lead required cross-checking with existing logs, but every comparison led back to the same result: no confirmed departure, no credible abduction evidence, no record of an emergency medical event, and no public appearance. The absence of movement and lack of recovery were documented as critical but inconclusive. State and federal systems also confirmed that there were no cross-border records matching Mark or Patricia. Airports, border crossings, intercity bus systems, and train stations did not show their names. The FBI did not locate any matching activity, and no nationwide bulletins provided additional context. With that, theories involving interstate travel or organized crime influence were reduced in priority. There was never enough information to confirm those possibilities in the first place. Months later, when every investigative thread had been reviewed and exhausted, decision-makers met to determine the status of the case. They concluded that the disappearance remained unexplained and required preservation rather than dismissal. Approximately 6 months after the initial report, the file was officially categorized as a cold case, where it would remain archived but available for reactivation if new evidence, technology, or testimony emerged. The announcement stated that the case was not closed and would be reopened immediately upon credible submission. Mark and Patricia Holden were never declared deceased at that time. Their case stayed in the system as unresolved adult disappearance, awaiting either discovery or reclassification. 25 years passed. Cedar Hills grew, changed, and slowly rebuilt its identity, but the Holden case stayed like a locked file at the back of a drawer. Nothing about it made sense.
2 adults disappeared without vehicles, without communication, and without any proven exit route. Their home stood for decades, sold, repainted, and remodeled, but the story beneath it never closed. In early 2024, a statewide cold case initiative announced by the Montana Department of Justice aimed to re-examine unsolved disappearances that lacked confirmed evidence of survival, relocation, or accidental death. Among the 32 selected cases was the disappearance of Mark and Patricia Holden. Detective Lauren Carter, age 41, became the new lead. She was known for working quietly, independently, and data first, not story first. She didn't care about old assumptions, public theories, or emotional rumors. She once stated in an interview, "A case is not cold because it can't be solved. It's cold because something was missed."
Her first step was not interviewing people. It was reading. She requested every page, every photograph, every sealed envelope, and every log sheet related to case file CH 1999-0175. The stack contained more than 600 pages, including original police notes, emergency call transcripts, lab slips, handwritten addendums, and the original scene photos taken on disposable film. She separated documents into 3 folders: verified evidence, unanswered questions, and procedural gaps. The third pile grew larger than she expected. One detail caught her attention immediately: the basement report. It mentioned the smell of fresh paint and uneven concrete coloring. But the conclusion column had one line: no further action required. There was no photograph specifically targeting the area, no documented measurement, and no follow-up entry. Carter highlighted that page twice and circled it. She reviewed the rest with the same approach: door locks, vehicles, financials, personal belongings, neighbor interviews, and landline phone records all pointed to a scenario with no logical conclusion. There was no documented exit route and no documented struggle. She concluded that either the investigation failed to identify a physical departure, or it failed to identify a concealed crime scene. Next, she needed access to the property. The original Holden residence at 2716 Maple Ridge Road was now owned by a couple who bought it as a resale home more than a decade earlier. Carter contacted them and explained the nature of the renewed investigation, the reasoning behind the basement review, and what procedures might be required if forensic testing began. The homeowners agreed, stating, "If there's something under our home that belongs to someone else's story, we don't want to live above it," and signed the consent form while also requesting court protection on liability. With cooperation secured, Carter filed an affidavit request before the Gallatin County Court to authorize forensic intrusion into structural elements of the property. She did not mention hidden remains or suspected burial. She phrased it as physical anomaly requiring examination to exclude or confirm forensic potential. The judge approved, but required that every phase be recorded and supervised. A new forensic search plan was built, not the same style as 1999. This time, technology would lead before tools. The team brought ground-penetrating radar, equipment capable of detecting subterranean disturbances, voids, or density shifts through concrete and earth. The basement floor was scanned in a slow grid pattern with 3 readings per lane. Near the eastern wall, the GPR returned an inconsistent waveform that differed from the uniform foundation across the rest of the basement. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was enough to justify excavation. The house was declared a temporary forensic zone, and access was restricted to law enforcement, the homeowners and certified technicians. All furniture, storage containers, and loose items were tagged, photographed, and repositioned outside the workspace under a weather-sealed tent. The electricity in the basement was shut off for safety, and cameras were installed to continuously record. For the first time in 25 years, the Holden house was again treated as an active crime scene. The excavation required a method called controlled cut. This meant cutting specific floor sections in small squares to prevent vibration disturbance and preserve material stratigraphy. Each piece of concrete removed was placed into labeled evidence trays. The process moved slowly, with dust containment fans, protective suits, and chain of custody tags at every step. During the removal of the second layer, the team noticed a shift in the color tone of underlying soil. The original construction plans from 1978 confirmed that the basement floor should have uniform fill material. This soil was different, darker, less compacted, and slightly damp compared with the soil sample from the opposite side of the foundation. At that point, Carter ordered a full stop work pause. Forensic excavation could no longer be handled as mere anomaly investigation. It required legal conformity to homicide excavation protocol. Additional witnesses were called, including a county legal observer, a property owner representative, and an independent forensic recorder. Body-worn cameras were resynced, and excavation resumed in smaller increments. Soil samples were collected using stainless steel trowels to avoid contamination. A trace amount of what appeared to be textile fiber was observed, but not identified on site. Every handful of soil was sifted, bagged, labeled, and entered into evidence documentation. The team proceeded until the entire subsurface depression was mapped, confirming it did not match natural settlement or construction variation. The consistency, layering, and depth indicated intentional placement.
Because the excavation phase was not yet complete, Carter did not draw conclusions. Instead, she ordered that all soil samples, textile fragments, metallic traces, and microscopic particulate be shipped under sealed chain of custody to the Montana State Forensic Laboratory. Only laboratory analysis would decide whether the anomaly was structural, environmental, or criminal. She closed her field notes with one sentence that later appeared in internal documentation. This case no longer reads like a disappearance. It reads like a location. And for the first time since 1999, the Holden investigation moved forward. The excavation inside the Holden basement moved slowly, with each inch of concrete removed under legal supervision, body-worn cameras recording, and every tool passed marked in the evidence log. Investigators remained professional, but no one in the room underestimated what could be found beneath a sealed structure that had remained untouched for 25 years. When the final section of concrete lifted and exposed a layer of soil that looked different from the original house foundation, the tone of the operation shifted. The soil appeared compacted in a manner inconsistent with natural settling, darker in color, and layered in a way that suggested intentional backfill. Moments later, fragments that resembled human remains were visible. The basement was no longer a suspicious area. It was immediately treated as a probable burial site. The forensic team worked in silence, documenting each discovery. The first confirmed bone fragment was located several inches below the altered soil layer, followed by additional fragments positioned close together, indicating a purposeful burial rather than scattered decomposition. As the excavation continued, it became clear that the remains did not belong to just one individual. Differences in bone size, structure, and placement suggested that two separate adults had been buried side by side. This finding aligned with the original missing persons report from 1999, where both heads of the Holden household disappeared on the same night, leaving no travel record, no personal belongings removed, and no confirmed sightings afterward.
Once the remains were carefully removed and secured under chain of custody procedures, forensic personnel turned their attention to the surrounding soil for environmental evidence. Microscopic testing later confirmed that the decomposition timeline was not recent and aligned with a late 1999 to early 2000 burial range, consistent with the period immediately following the disappearance. There was no evidence of later disturbance, no secondary digging, no shifting, no fractures caused by post-mortem movement. Everything pointed to a single burial event occurring shortly after Mark and Patricia were last confirmed seen alive. Near the remains, investigators recovered a corroded metallic object whose shape and mechanism were consistent with a compact semi-automatic firearm estimated to match a .38 caliber handgun. Despite corrosion, the frame and slide contours were still identifiable, but the serial number remained unreadable due to oxidation and long-term soil contact. A crime lab technician later estimated that the weapon had likely been buried at the same time as the remains, based on corrosion patterns and soil mineral absorption. One investigator recalled stating, "This wasn't thrown here by accident. Whoever placed it wanted it to stay hidden." Further forensic analysis revealed evidence of ballistic injury on the skull fragments. The fracture pattern indicated impact trauma, consistent with close-range gunfire rather than blunt force injury or accidental damage. Trajectory analysis could not be fully reconstructed because of fragmentation, but the presence of a probable firearm near the remains strengthened classification toward violent homicide. At the same time, forensic scientists worked on identity verification. Advanced DNA extraction methods were used, including mitochondrial and autosomal DNA sequencing, allowing degraded remains to be matched against living relatives. Samples were collected from Andrew and Jacob through voluntary cooperation, and results returned indicating first-degree biological relationship with both recovered individuals. A dental records comparison was also conducted using preserved fillings, alignment, and wear patterns recorded during dental checkups from 1997. These findings confirmed identity with full confidence. With identity and cause of death established, the case was officially reclassified as homicide, ending nearly a quarter-century of uncertainty regarding whether the couple had left voluntarily, met with an accident, or staged a disappearance. The shift from missing persons to homicide changed the legal status of the investigation, triggered new evidence admissibility requirements, and allowed investigators to issue extended subpoenas. It also justified renewed interviews with family members, acquaintances, and any individuals connected to the household in 1999. The first decision was to bring Andrew and Jacob back to provide supplemental statements, not through informal questioning like in the earlier years, but under sworn protocol. Both were now adults, and any information they provided would be reviewed alongside the new forensic timeline. Investigators worked with clinical professionals to assess whether there were behavioral inconsistencies or stress-related memory gaps that might explain missing details from the original statements. The purpose was not accusation, but clarity. As one detective commented, "When facts buried in concrete surface after 25 years, every old assumption becomes obsolete." With the remains positively identified, investigators revisited financial and administrative records from late 1999. They extracted archived banking documents, insurance status, loan history, private correspondence, and employment files to determine if any major event, conflict, or
undisclosed pressure existed at the time. They also analyzed patterns surrounding Mark's unexplained cash withdrawal 5 days before the disappearance, aiming to determine whether it played any role in the events that followed or whether it was purely coincidental. Next, investigators evaluated family dynamics and potential stressors that were not visible in earlier screenings. They requested school counselor archives, workplace attendance patterns, library personnel evaluations, and medical clinic visit logs from the months leading up to the incident. The goal was to identify any shift that could align with the forensic timeline, whether financial, emotional, occupational, or interpersonal.
Finally, the forensic timeline suggested that burial occurred quickly, efficiently, and with knowledge of the house structure. This raised a key investigative point. Whoever carried out the burial had access, opportunity, and uninterrupted time during the period immediately following the disappearance. The burial also required physical capability and at least basic familiarity with concrete or construction procedures, especially given the smoothness of the final surface and the absence of visible cracks, uneven leveling, or improper reinforcement. Through evidence alone, the case had transitioned from unanswered absence to confirmed homicide, changing not only how the file was handled, but how every detail from 1999 would now be interpreted. Nothing in the original records could continue to be assumed, and nothing from the original interviews could be accepted without modern forensic alignment. The Holden case was no longer about where Mark and Patricia went. It became a question entirely focused on who placed them beneath their own basement floor, and how that act remained undetected for 25 years. The discovery inside the basement changed the direction of the investigation and forced every remaining detail from 1999 to be re-examined with new weight. The announcement to the public had barely settled when both Holden brothers were contacted by the Montana Department of Justice. They were no longer part of a missing persons case. They were now the only two surviving immediate relatives connected directly to a confirmed double homicide that took place inside their childhood home. Both Andrew and Jacob agreed to cooperate and were scheduled for separate formal interviews. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and archived to become part of the new case file. Investigators wanted to rebuild the chain of events from the last 3 months of 1999 and compare it with what was now physically found beneath the concrete. Andrew was asked to recount the family atmosphere before his parents disappeared. His tone during the recorded interview was steady, though occasionally guarded. He mentioned that the household was not chaotic, but it was not completely smooth either. According to him, there were discussions about finances and Jacob's plans for after high school. He did not classify it as extreme conflict, saying, "It wasn't violent. It was more like everybody was tired and didn't agree on how things should move forward." He did not recall any threats, ultimatums, or physical altercations during that period. Jacob, on the other hand, gave a shorter and less detailed description of that time. He said there were occasional arguments, but they sounded familiar and not alarming. When asked whether he had heard anything unusual on the night his parents disappeared, he paused before acknowledging that he had heard something that could have been a loud object hitting the floor or maybe a door slamming hard. When the investigator clarified whether the sound could have been a gunshot, Jacob responded that he did not associate it with danger and did not leave his room to check. He repeated that he never imagined anything violent was happening inside the house. Both brothers denied any knowledge of basement activity, any memory of tools, bags of concrete, fresh paint, or late-night repairs. They also denied seeing anyone enter the house through the back or basement area in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Their statements showed no detailed reference to construction materials or digging, and neither recalled their father having a reason to work on the basement floor. When confronted with the forensic findings, both expressed shock
and repeatedly stated that they had no awareness that their parents were buried beneath the home. At that point, a request was made by the Holden family attorney for psychological and memory assessment. The evaluation was not intended to determine guilt, but to establish whether trauma or delayed processing might have affected their recall. The clinical notes described long-term emotional stress associated with unresolved disappearance, but did not conclude that either brother displayed symptoms of false memory formation or memory suppression. The report also mentioned that neither showed signs of deliberate avoidance patterns consistent with concealed knowledge, though it emphasized that psychological assessment cannot be used as determination of innocence.
Parallel to the interviews, investigators examined weapon-related evidence from 1999. Records from local firearm retailers, pawn shops, and private dealers were requested. One record showed that .38 caliber ammunition was purchased during the same year using cash, with no signature or ID requirement due to the existing laws and retail standards at the time. This meant that investigators could not confirm whether the ammunition belonged to someone inside the Holden home, someone who visited, or an unrelated buyer with coincidental timing. Financial records from 1999 were rechecked, including bank statements, receipts, small hardware store transactions, and any payments that might hint at construction materials. The unexplained cash withdrawal by Mark on November 10th remained an unresolved detail, and no direct evidence connected the money to basement work. Searches across invoices for cement, reinforcing wire, temporary tools, or contractor rental did not produce definitive matches. Investigators also considered the possibility of an outside participant. They reviewed community connections, workplace associates, construction crew contacts, library staff, neighbors, hunting groups, and church groups. Everyone close enough to be relevant during late 1999 was placed into a new list, separated by motive, opportunity, and physical ability categories. The initial review did not locate an immediately suspicious individual, though a few names required additional background checks due to proximity, access, or undocumented house visits. Despite the breakthroughs in forensic evidence, no arrest warrant or indictment was approved. The reason was not due to lack of seriousness, but because criminal charges require evidence that identifies a responsible actor, not only evidence proving that a homicide occurred. Without proof of who handled the firearm, who carried out the burial, or who secured the basement floor afterward, the case could not move forward legally. Investigators could not risk issuing charges that might fail in court due to insufficient linkage. The Department of Justice decided to make a public appeal. A press advisory was issued, encouraging anyone with information from the late 1990s, whether direct, rumored, or seemingly irrelevant, to come forward. The announcement emphasized the forensic confirmation and asked for details regarding suspicious purchases, home visits, arguments, unusual behavior, or references to the basement made by anyone connected to the Holden family around that period. The hotline, email, and anonymous drop methods were all activated, and the case was added to multiple cold case broadcast systems. Additionally, contacts were made to federal and interstate authorities for case comparison. Archived files from neighboring states, unsolved domestic cases, violent crime patterns, and missing adult investigations were scanned for potential linkage. The Holden case was also synchronized with NamUs and cross-referenced with FBI databases for behavioral match indicators relevant to homicide scenes involving residential burial. Despite all added efforts, no immediate new witness stepped forward, and no physical evidence beyond the basement was discovered. The forensic findings were undeniable. The victims had been identified. The cause of death was established, and the burial location was proven intentional. But the responsible party remained unidentified. With no direct offender, no recorded confession, no confirmed motive, and no forensic match to a living person, the file retained its open status rather than closing. At the conclusion of the legal update, the Montana Department of Justice formally stated that the case would remain active without deadline. They noted that modern forensic technology continues to advance, and that unresolved homicide cases do not expire. The official position recorded in the file was that the investigation remains open pending new evidence, new testimony, or technological breakthroughs. The final stage of the investigation focused on confirming the identities of the two victims found beneath the Holden basement floor, and officially determining the legal status of the case after 25 years. Forensic teams began with DNA profiling using preserved samples collected from Andrew and Jacob Holden, followed by a dental comparison, using records archived from a 1997 routine medical file. The results matched both victims with statistical certainty consistent with U.S. forensic standards, confirming that the remains were those of 52-year-old Mark Holden and 47-year-old Patricia Holden, who were listed as missing since November 1999. No alternate identity was possible based on biological evidence, age range, skeletal structure, and dental signatures. After identity confirmation, medical examiners documented the cause of death through skeletal trauma analysis. Multiple fractures in specific cranial zones matched the pattern of gunshot injury delivered at close range. These observations, paired with the presence of a metallic object believed to be a firearm located in the same burial space, enabled investigators to officially classify the cause of death for both victims as gunshot homicide. There were no signs of accidental injury, environmental death, or natural causes. The trauma was consistent, targeted, and fatal, allowing the investigative team to close the debate regarding manner and cause. Once those findings were certified, law enforcement was legally required to reclassify the case. The Holden disappearance, previously recorded as a missing persons file under classification CH 1999-0175, was officially transferred into the Homicide Division of the Montana Department of Justice. All future legal actions, investigative updates, and evidentiary reviews would fall under homicide protocol instead of missing persons administrative procedure. This change was logged in both county and state systems, making the crime subject to renewed investigational oversight rather than simple archival status. During this transition, the legal standing of the case was assessed. Because no confirmed suspect, accomplice, or motive had been established, the file was classified as homicide undetermined offender, a designation used when the victims are confirmed, the method is verified, the crime is proven, but the responsible party is not yet identified, to a prosecutorial standard. According to Montana legal guidelines, such a classification does not imply closure, nor does it indicate abandonment. It remains an active record without expiration. All physical evidence recovered from the basement site, including human remains, biological traces, soil samples, microscopic fibers, and the corroded firearm-shaped metallic object, was transferred to long-term secure storage under chain of custody restrictions at the Montana State Forensic Evidence Facility. Chain of custody logs record every officer, lab worker, or legal professional who interacts with the materials for the remainder of the case's lifespan. Samples may be re-examined if new technology emerges, but cannot be destroyed without a formal order. According to a forensic technician involved in the case, "We preserve everything because what you cannot prove today, you may be able to prove tomorrow." Following evidence storage, the case was uploaded to NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, to ensure digital cross-checking across federal, interstate, and archival datasets. This entry enables potential matching with individuals, suspects, crime patterns, or weapons that may appear in future cases or retrospective searches. NamUs allows public, private, and law enforcement restricted queries, expanding the possibility of external breakthroughs outside Montana jurisdiction. The residents at 2716 Maple Ridge Road, where the remains were recovered, received an official designation as a crime history property. Under Montana real estate disclosure law, any future sale, transfer, or rental of the residence requires documented disclosure of its involvement in a homicide investigation and forensic excavation. This designation does not determine property safety, but establishes legal transparency for all future ownership and occupation. Along with legal reclassification, the Montana Department of Justice launched a renewed information request to the public. A state-managed hotline number, official email address, and anonymous online reporting portal were released. These platforms prioritize contributions from anyone with direct or indirect knowledge of interactions, events, or unusual activity linked to the Holden home, workplace contacts, contract labor, or unexplained behavior in late 1999 or early 2000. Reports can be submitted without name, physical appearance, or personal involvement details. According to a DOJ spokesperson, time changes loyalty, but it also changes willingness. What was impossible to say in 1999 may be simpler to say in 2024. The Montana State Forensic Laboratory recommended that, if a new suspect emerges, DNA sequencing, gunshot residue comparison, and isotopic analysis may be expanded using the preserved evidence. These additional tests were not available or sufficiently advanced in 1999 and may lead to future conclusions if a known individual can be compared against current databases. The firearm-shaped metallic object may also become testable through corrosion-resistant recovery methods not yet standard in 2024. The Holden file was then categorized in the active cold case review cycle, scheduled for reassessment every 24 months under state protocol. This reassessment will include new forensic technology checks, re-interviews only if appropriate, database comparison updates, and any alignment with new criminal cases that share procedural similarities. Cold cases in this category remain legally active unless a court, statute, or confirmed suspect allows closure. The final public statement emphasizes that the investigation remains open without a predetermined time limit. It will not be labeled unsolved in legal documentation, only pending. The determination of responsibility, involvement, or motive remains unknown, but the factual status of homicide is complete, validated, and permanent. The case stands as one of the longest recorded unresolved dual homicides documented in the Cedar Hills region, and its future depends entirely on new information that can be independently verified. Now, I want to hear what you think. If you were reviewing this case, which detail feels like the key that was never fully explored? Comment your thoughts, your theory, or your unanswered question below.